What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush episode review. Today, guys, we are going to be going over episode 7 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush. I'm very excited, as always, to be discussing these episodes with you guys, so without further ado, let's jump right into the review. So, generally speaking, what were my thoughts on episode 7 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush? I thought it was a pretty boring episode, if I'm gonna be completely honest. The biggest thing with this episode is that not a whole lot really happened. Now, I will say this, it's not a terrible episode. I do think this episode does have some moments, it did have some pretty comedic moments throughout the episode, but besides that, I just felt like this episode, honestly, this is probably the first episode of Go Rush where I feel like you could just skip this episode and you wouldn't really miss out on a whole lot. I mean, this episode, really the entire purpose of the episode was teaching Udius about, the different attributes and the different types of monsters in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh, as well as learning a little bit more about defense position monsters, more specifically tribute summon monsters in defense position, which I'll kind of talk about that a little bit later on in the video because I have some mixed feelings on them doing it in this episode. But we got to start off at the beginning of the episode where we basically have Udius, trying to learn more about the game of Rush Duels to the point where he breaks into a shop. Like, he literally uses his sword to cut a hole in the door, which, by the way, the shop was closed, just so that way he can get the latest Yugioh Go Rush magazine to basically help him learn more about Rush Duels. And basically he takes that back, he puts in the DVD set that came with it and basically was listening to the audio to learn about the attributes and to learn about the types, which I'm going to discuss a little bit more on that closer to the end because there was some notable things that were missed upon Udius learning about these that I feel like needs to be explained. But I'll get into that in a little bit. But Udius is trying to learn about these, he ends up falling asleep from listening to the tape and then decides to make his attention to Yuhi and asks him to basically teach him about Rush Duels. And at first, Yuhi didn't really have any interest to teach him about Rush Duels, but after Yuumu had offered to teach him more about Rush Duels, as a sign of jealousy, Yuhi decides, what, I will teach you about Rush Duels. And, Udius is happy about this, but before they can even learn anything, Yuhi goes on his own because he has his own way of teaching Udius more about Rush Duels. So we see him going off doing his own thing, and then we get to kind of see a little bit more on the side of Mr. Dazaki and kind of see, what he really does around the UTS building. And apparently he is a gardener, which was very fascinating to say the least. And that's another thing to kind of point out with this is that now we get a little bit more with Mr. Dazaki. I think this shows that now this is his aspect that is different from Galliant from Sevens, because a thing that I've been noticing with each of the different characters from UTS that have similar last names from Yu-Gi-Oh! Sevens, Mr. Dazaki, Mr. Yagi, Miss Maki, Mr. Omaino, all of them have, they have similar designs, but they have completely different personalities in the sense of what they do. I mean, you had Miss Maki, who just likes to water plants and even the sidewalk, because apparently that's a thing that people do, I guess. You have Mr. Yagi, who, although, yeah, he still does cook, and that's his whole entire thing, it's the food that he actually cooks that's completely different. In fact, with Miss Maki, who also was someone I like to cook a lot, in this case being sushi, there's no sign of that whatsoever. And then you had Mr. Dazaki, who we know from Galliant being, the guy that just, followed Asana and basically was all about machinery. But Mr. Dazaki, his whole thing is gardening, or at least from this episode, it informs me that he's more into the whole gardening route. So, I'm really starting to believe, and I think most people are starting to agree with this as well, that these characters, whether or not they're related to Seven's characters, who the hell knows, but though I think the thing we can be most confident on with these characters is that there is no way in hell that these could be the same characters. Now, I understand that, obviously when you get older, maybe your interests change, but I don't know, like, these different changes to these characters, I don't know, I feel like it's a little too much to really say that, oh, they just decided to change it as they got older and they, explored a little bit more in different professions. Like, I don't know, like, I just feel like I don't think they would have changed this much, in my opinion. And especially since if this is the AU route, which I feel like most people are starting to lean towards as, Go Rush has continued with the episodes and we kind of learned a little bit more about these characters. I think a lot of people are starting to go down the AU route, which I totally agree. I absolutely think this is an AU. I just think that there's just so many differences with this show that there's just no way that this can be the same universe as Seven's. I just don't believe it. And I know some people think that this can still tie into Seven's. We're going to have to obviously wait and see on that, but I don't know. Like, I think I can confidently say this is an AU. There's just way too many differences with this show to really make me believe that this is in the same universe as Seven's. There's just no way that this can be in the same universe as Seven's based off of all the stuff that we've known so far with this show. But that's, in my opinion, some people might still think that this is a sequel to Seven's, but I just don't believe it. I just think with the stuff that we have right now, there's just no way. It's not saying it's not possible, it's just that the more we get more information about these characters and the setting that we're in, I just cannot believe that these are going to be in the same universe as Seven's. There's just no way that that can be the case, but we're going to have to wait and see like that. I could be completely wrong, we're still way too early into this show, but obviously we're going to have to wait and see on that. But after that whole little detour, Yuhi had finished his little contraption, and this is one thing I will say I did like about the episode is we got to see more of Yuhi's personality from his building aspect of his character, because we knew that he was an inventor and we haven't really seen too much of that throughout the show. Obviously you can maybe say like the Earthamar, but I feel like the Earthamar is not really something of like his, ability to actually like create something. I feel like that was just a substance that he had found, and it just created like this weird Yuki kind of persona. Like, again, I don't really know what the hell the Earthamar really is, but I feel like that was not something that he created, more something that he had found. This is seeing more of like what you're expecting of Yuhi as an inventor, and it's basically just this truck with a little wagon on the back of it that basically plays this tape that gives Yugioh multiple questions to answer in regards to Rush Duel. And he's very excited by this. He gets in the back of the wagon, and at first, everything was going smoothly. Yugioh was just in the back of the wagon answering the questions. Yuhi is just at the front, driving alongside the Velvigas ship. They're just riding in the front, driving Yugioh around. They had a couple of bumps, but, Yuhi plays that off as, just being part of the training experience. Yugioh is completely fine with it. And everything was going fine until Yuhi hits a massive bump and ends up sending the Velgias ship right into the center panel of the truck, which makes it malfunction to where Yuhi no longer had control of the truck. So basically they're out of control. He can't control it anymore. He ends up going through a fence and leaving the UTS building, and Yuumu and Mr. Tazaki were shocked by this and basically tried to go and chase after it, but obviously since they don't have any sort of transportation, basically they had to follow the tracks on foot to basically see where the hell they even went. And Yuhi is trying to get a hold of the situation because he can't figure out why nothing is working. working, and he ends up running into Manabu and Neanderstar, which are just enjoying a normal day. You know, they're at the coffee shop drinking their tea and all that stuff, or it's probably coffee, not tea, whatever the case might be. But Manabu and Neanderstar get caught in this as well. They're in the back now with Yugioh, and they don't know what the hell's going on, and Yuhi informs them that something happened with the vehicle to where he can no longer control it, and he's trying to stop it, but he can't do anything. The only way that they can actually stop the truck is that they continued answering the questions and get all 100 questions correct. Which, by the way, the fact that there's even 100 questions in this is mind-boggling to me, because Rush Duels are such a simple format, and you know, it's not like the Master Rule format where I feel like 100 questions makes a whole lot more sense. In fact, I feel like you can have 1,000 questions, and I feel like that would make a lot of sense because of how complicated the game of the Master Rule format is. But the fact that Rush Duels had 100 questions into it, like, that to me was very surprising. But maybe it's just because, you know, they were doing different, like, scenarios, like, you know, you had this monster attacking over this monster, like, how much damage is being dealt. Like, maybe that was some of the questions, but you know, it doesn't matter in the long shot because we don't get to see all the questions. We see like 5 questions answered during the entire time, and Manabu decides, you know what, because we need to stop this vehicle before any more damage is dealt, I'm just going to answer the questions myself since he knows the game of Rush Duels. However, apparently this system that he created made it to where Yugioh is the only person that can answer the questions. No one else can answer them, so Yugioh has to answer all 100 questions in order to stop the vehicle from moving. So basically, this is all up to Yugioh to answer the questions, and you know, he is able to successfully answer some of the questions. You know, they're continuously answering the questions, and they get to the 98th question, which asks Yugioh about the attributes, and he was able to mention all the attributes, you know, fire, wind, water, earth, light, and dark, and you know, he is able to get the answer correct. And then the 99th question is, so far from what we've seen, Yugioh's difficult challenge from all of these 100 questions, because he was asked to name every single type in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh, which there are 23, well, now 24 because of the Galaxy type, and Yugioh was kind of struggling to remember all the different types. That was until he remembered that there was a song that they taught when they were doing all their drills and stuff that basically helped him memorize all of the different types, because during that marching song, it mentioned every single type in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! So basically, that was his way of being able to remember all the different types by singing that song that Yugioh had taught them. So that was a pretty cool tie-in as well. I did really like that moment. And he was able to get the question correctly. And it seems like, you know, everything's going to be completely fine now. But they realize that Yugioh needs to answer the last question very quickly, because if he does not answer it fast enough, they're going to drive straight off of a cliff, because apparently, you know, with them driving so quickly, they end up driving up a mountain, and it got so bad to the point where now Yugioh on his final question has to answer the question fast enough to where, you know, if he doesn't answer the question fast enough, they're just going to drive straight off the cliff and more than likely die. So now it's up to Yugioh to answer the final question, and the final question was about, you know, defense position monsters again, which he had learned about in episode 5, and the question that was asked was, when you tribute summon a monster and you want to put it in defense position, do you put it in face-up defense position, or do you have to set the monster like you would normally do with other monsters, where you have to set them in defense position and then flip them in face-up defense before you can actually keep them in defense position? So Yugioh now has to figure this question out, because he's never seen this scenario at all. He's never been taught the scenario, but he was able to get the question correctly, and he was basically able to stop the car from going off of the edge of the cliff. So, it seems like Yugioh had saved the day because he was able to answer the question, which, before I continue with that, can I just mention this? Why didn't Manabu just give him the answers? Like, Yugioh literally had to sit there and think about the different attributes, or not the attributes, the types, excuse me, and especially with the final question he had to think about as well because he never learned it. Why didn't Manabu just tell him the answers? Because the thing wasn't programmed to where Yugioh couldn't cheat. All he said was that it can only respond to Yugioh's answers. So unless there was a system in there to where, Manabu couldn't give him the answers, why didn't he just help him with it? Like, obviously, from a storyline perspective, I understand why, because what's the point of Manabu giving him the answers? He's not going to learn anything if he just tells him the answers. Like, obviously, by doing this, you actually help him learn the game of Rush Duels. But if you're in a scenario where you're gonna drive off of a cliff and potentially die if you don't get these answers correct and you don't get them answered fast enough, and to the point where if you don't, you're gonna die, why the hell do you just sit there and do nothing? Like, that to me made no freaking sense besides, the storyline aspect to it, or Yugioh needed to learn this on his own, so that's why he didn't have any help from Manabu. But I don't know, I felt like in that situation, Manabu should have thought smart, if you're going to be completely honest, and just gave him the answer, because they wouldn't have never had to be in that situation. But maybe it didn't matter, because after he was able to stop and barely was able to survive on the cliff, everything seemed fine until a pigeon landed onto the vehicle, in which made them drop because more weight was added to it. But the Velvia ship was basically able to repair itself and was able to go into its big size to be able to save them from falling basically to their death, and they were able to fly back off, and everything was completely fine at the end of it. And basically that was the end of the episode. Yugioh and Yuumu, were just sitting on the couch, and they learned about a new class for the Yugioh Go Rush magazine, the Master Class, which is basically the class above the Expert one, which is what Yugioh took. And Yugioh asked Yuhi if he can help him with that, and Yuhi had basically enough with that. So that was basically it for the episode. One thing that I wanted to mention that I mentioned earlier in the episode has to do with the attributes and the types themselves. Obviously, they went over the 6 main attributes in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! However, as most fans know, there actually are technically 7 attributes. You have Fire, Wind, Water, Earth, Light, Dark, and Divine. And there was no mention of the Divine attribute whatsoever, which I think most people agree that that one makes sense because there are no Divine cards in the game of Rush Duels, so that's why that one was not mentioned. But the one that so many people were talking about in this episode was that there was no mention of the Cyborg type, the Magical Knight type, Celestial Warrior, High Dragon, and Omega Psychic. All 5 of those types were not mentioned in the 24 types that Yugioh learned about in this episode, and this has caused a lot of talk in regards to this, in whether or not, maximums and fusions actually do exist in the Go Rush universe, or, do they not exist at all, or do they exist and for some reason they didn't talk about it at all. In my opinion, I do believe maximums and fusions exist in this universe. I do think they are an established thing in the Go Rush universe, and I know a lot of people will say, well, how are they established, but they never mentioned it in this episode. Easy solution to that. It's in the Master Class. Like, the Expert Class, you learn more of, the basics still of dueling, but, in a more advanced style. But in the Master Class, that's where you learn the more important summoning mechanics, like maximum summoning, like fusion summoning, and maybe even special summoning as well, because I do think that's pretty prevalent as well. Although, funny enough, they did mention it in this episode for the first time, when Manabu was kind of explaining how, tribute summoning a monster in defense position actually works, to where you can summon a monster in defense position face up, but you have to special summon it. That's the only way that you could do that. So we kind of did learn a little bit about special summoning in this episode, which I don't think we've really learned too much about, but I don't know, I don't really mind that whatsoever. And I guess I should mention it as well, the whole fact that we did learn about defense positioning monsters in this episode, I had mixed feelings on it because, I feel like you could have probably just explained this in episode 5 because of the fact that, the entire episode was focused around that, and the fact that you just went out of your way to explain in this episode, I felt was a little bit weird, but at the same time, it makes a lot of sense because it gives you a scenario where the UDS actually think about all of the knowledge that you know so far of rush duels to be able to answer this question and basically has to put it together. That aspect I really do think is pretty interesting, so that's why I have mixed feelings on that. Not necessarily a bad thing, it's just something I kind of thought about as the episode did progress. But with that being said, that's really it for the episode. Hope you guys enjoyed. Was not expecting to go as long as I did, but, obviously not too much happened in the episode, but I still do hope you guys enjoyed the review. Let me know your guys' thoughts on episode 7. Did you like the episode? Did you think it was an okay episode? Or were you not really a big fan of this episode? Let me know if you guys believe that Maximums and Fusion monsters are in this Go Rush universe, or do you think they do not exist at all and they're gonna have to be discovered as the series does progress, or do you think that they are gonna be learned in the masterclass? We'll love to know all your guys' thoughts on this episode down below, but with that being said, that's gonna be it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, guys, take care and have yourselves a great rest of your day.